we had been talking about French School of Comparative Literature, is it? So French School of Comparative Literature had been talking about influence. Influence of what? Influence of our literature to others, and influence of other literature to the national literature. And we also talked about the national literature and also the national identity. We also talked about the linkage between comparative studies and cultural studies, how cultural studies and how cultural identity can be a part of comparative literature. Okay. Especially France and Germany, these two countries were economically solvent in their perspectives. So they are they were trying to have their own identity. Actually, they were trying to put German and French literature in one hand, and they wanted to put German and French literature, other parts of European literature in another hand. That means they were trying to compare French and German literature to other parts of the Europe and also the other parts of this world. And here, another composer, his name is Jagannath. He said that this fairy tale, myth, legend, and folklore, and not literary history for the later in the history of the human mind, viewed through the art of literature. In this subdivision of thematology, however, one consider only the subject matter. Previously, that means up to this stage, we have got that idea that comparative literature with interdisciplinarity. That means we will be comparing anything from a literature to other literature from other language. But this Jagannath, he said that we have to compare the theme only. And if comparative literature is supposed to compare the theme of one literature with the theme of other literature, that sort of study in comparative literature is called thematology. Okay, thematology. However, comparative literature through how could comparative literature flourish in the country in which the plays of Shakespeare, Molière, Eugene O'Neill were banned for the stage, and where the novels of great French and Russian writers were no longer accessible? So if you see that German and French literature, and in many countries especially, they are not ready to accept the literature published in Europe. Because why? The European countries, they were trying to prove that their literature is great, and for this reason they are trying to, that means the countries apart from the Europe, they were trying to uplift their own literature. So what will be the scenario? That was an analogy. And here D. Lomnich, Hungarian scholar and professor, views strike us today as both enlightened and far-reaching. He correctly predicted that the significance of translation in the development of comparative literature. He said, apart from the theme, apart from the language, apart from the text, apart from the boundary, translation could be could be a part of comparative literature. This Hungarian scholar and professor, according to his definition, he said that comparative literature, translation studies should be an integral part or important part of comparative literature, according to this scholar. And Lomnich had little impact of the development of comparative literature outside Eastern Europe. Translation studies, translation of what? That means translation of the European literature. Okay. So this Hungarian professor, he again put emphasis translation, but he was trying to put focus on the Eastern Europe literature. if you move forward, we see that René Wallach, he said here, American Czech literary critic, René Wallach. It is impossible to draw a line between comparative literature and general literature. Between, say, the influence of Walter Scott in France and the rise of the historical novel, beside the term general literature lends itself to confusion. It has been understood to mean literary history, politics, and the principles of literature. René Wallach, an American Czech critic, he said that whenever we will be judging a literature within the boundary, then it will be the demeaning of literature. It means that previously German and the French critic, they were trying to put literature within Europe. So that idea was challenged by this American Czech critic. He said that literature should overcome the boundary, and that is his definition, and that is his attitude. Whose attitude? René Wallach attitude. And here we see another. Comparative literature should study the impact of works by named individual, hence it was author-centered. So if we compare a literature within a boundary, so and works of an individual writer, that would be author-centered. An enormous amount of time and energy was expended to trying to determine what the boundary line should be. German and French critics, they said that literature should be within the Europe. And American critics said that if it is so, that if comparative literature remains within the boundary of Europe, that would be narrow perspectives. So what would be the line of comparative literature? There is an analogy. And in this way, we can go forward beyond the boundary of Europe. So in Europe perspectives, German school, French school, they had a perspective of comparative literature. René Wallach changed that yes, if we compare literature within the boundary of a country or even a continent, that would be narrow. We should overcome the boundary in case of judging a comparative literature. Henry Hermann Remarque. He is a professor emeritus of comparative literature, German, West European studies, and he is studying in Bloomington, Indiana, USA, where he spent most of his professional life at Indiana University, USA. He said that in 1961 collection of essays published by Southern Illinois University Press, those essays were edited by Newton Stackelnecht, Horst Frenz, and Henry Remarque, who attempted to define comparative literature in an extended perspective. So Remarque said that comparative literature is the study of literature beyond confines of one particular country. So this man, especially the Remarque, he said that comparative literature should be compared with the literature of one country to the other country. So in case of comparative literature, the boundary of the country shouldn't play a vital role. That means we have to go beyond the boundary line. The boundary may be European literature, boundary may be
American literature, boundary may be African literature, or the other country's national literature or national identity, whatever you say. That he said that comparative literature is the study of literature beyond the confines of a particular country. That means you have to go beyond the boundary. And comparison of literature with other spheres of human expression. So literature can be the expression of one human expression of an individual country. যদি কোনো একটা দেশের লিটারেচার নিয়ে আমরা আলোচনা করি তাহলে সেটা কনফাইন থাকবে একটা রিজনের উপরে। যখন আমরা এটা ওভারকাম করে অন্য জায়গায় যাব দেন সেটাই হয়ে যাবে যে আদার স্পিয়ার্স অফ হিউম্যান expression. So comparative literature should not be compared with other should not be compared within the country's boundary. It go beyond the boundary of a country. So Remek's comment, that means what his comment? He said that comparative literature should go beyond the boundary of a country. That very basis established the norms of American School of Comparative. American comparative literature that was distinct from the French school, thereby breaking the power of French model of once and for all. So French School of Comparative Literature is the first school. They had been talking about the influence. Influence of what? Influence of one literature with other literature. But they were always trying to confine their literature within the boundary of their continent or even in their boundary. But Remek's comment said that comparative literature should be compared beyond the boundary line. That means comparative literature has gone to an aspect that is more universal. That means comparative literature, any literature from any country can be compared with other literature from other countries. So there shouldn't be any great literature, there shouldn't be less important literature in case of the comment done by Henry Remek. And that is the basis of American School of Comparative Literature. Remek believed that the French approach was too narrow. The French approach was too narrow and relied too heavily on factual evidence. Influences studies in French tradition. That means French School of Comparative Literature always talked about the influence. So influence studies in the French tradition, he argued, was unimaginative, deriving from a positivist approach, and so he presented an alternative model. Who? That means Remek. In a good many influence studies, the location of sources has been given to much attention. Rather than such question are what was retained and what was rejected. So whenever influence is the main component of comparative literature, so Remek put the comment. So কোন ইনফ্লুয়েন্স গুলো গ্রহণ করা হয়েছে, কোন ইনফ্লুয়েন্স গুলো কি করা হয়েছে, বাতিল করে দেওয়া হয়েছে. which one rejected and which one taken, and why and how was the material absorbed and integrated. কেনই এই ম্যাটেরিয়ালগুলো নেওয়া হলো এবং কেনই সেগুলোকে অ্যাবজর্ব করা হলো অন্য দেশের লিটারেচার রচনার ক্ষেত্রে. What is the answer? And what success? And what is the result of this? If conducted in this fashion, influence studies contribute not only to our knowledge of literary history, but to our understanding for the creative process and of the literary work of art. Okay, so if it is so, then যদি আমরা চিন্তা করি যে একটা লিটারেচারের কোন অংশটুকু আমরা নিব এবং কোন অংশটুকু আমরা বাদ দেব, এটা যদি এইভাবে চিন্তা করি তখন যেটা হবে কি যে লিটারেচারকে আমরা শুধুমাত্র লিটারেচারের আঙ্গিকেই as sake of art আমরা তুলনা করছি. যদি তাই হয় তাহলে থিমের কি হলো, কালচারের কি হলো, ট্রান্সলেশনের কি হলো, সমস্ত কিছু অরিজিন নিয়ে. সো দ্যাট ওয়াজ দ্য কোয়েশ্চেন পয়েন্টেড বাই হেনরি রেমেক. Following Remek, the American school, anything could be compared with anything else. Okay, so you can write the line. Yep, everybody. Following Remek, দেখা যাচ্ছে? মাথায়ও লিখে নিতে পারেন। Following remark, the American school, anything could be compared with anything else. মুখ থেকে শুনেন। And regardless even of whether it is literature or not. Okay. Up to this portion, we have been talking about literature of all languages with others, isn't it? Literature of one country with literature of other countries. But when Rimet said that this version of French comparative literature is too narrow, he said that anything can be compared with anything else, regardless of the literature. That means literature can be compared with literature. That was the previous idea. The next point that literature can be compared with culture. Literature can be compared with art. Literature can be compared with other human sciences or phenomena. So in this regard, American School of Comparative Literature invites universalism. That means they were trying to focus more on the subject of the literature of all other parts of this world. Got the point? The process of depoliticizing the comparative literature is a hallmark of American. There is a politics. Whenever French comparative school said that yes, our literature is great, our literature can be the southern part, the French literature can be compared with the other countries' literature, only the European countries. So, what does it mean? What is the politics over here? They want to say that yes, other country, one critic said that yes, one shelf of European schools, European libraries, one shelf can be compared with the whole range of African and Arabic literature. What does it mean? It means that they had been demeaning the importance of African and Arabic literature. So there is a politics of imperialism and colonial attitude. American literature, especially with the comment of Henry Remek, literature can be compared with all literature of the part, even literature can be compared with its culture. Literature can be compared with the other social sciences fields. So in this regard, comparative literature has been depoliticized and has become an universal approach of comparison where anything can be compared with anything else. Compare should be there. Okay, so in this regard, comparative literature gone with a new perspectives. Okay, and also this attitude is marked contrast with the development of comparative literature in Europe, and although heavily influenced by the new criticism. Okay, so Americans' School of Comparative Literature, their thought can be compared and can be inspired with a theoretical idea that is called new criticism. What is new criticism? New criticism was a formalist movement in literary theory that dominated American literary criticism in the middle decades of 20th century. It emphasized close reading, particularly of poetry, to discover how a work of literature functions as a self-contained and self-referential aesthetic object. Okay, so American School of Comparative Literature can be inspired by a theory that can be called new criticism. Again, there is another approach that is called formalist movement. In literary theory, formalism refers to the critical approaches that analyze, interpret, or evaluate the inherent features of a text. The formalistic approach reduces the importance of text historical, biographical, and cultural context. Okay, so American School of Comparative Literature was influenced by formalism and also influenced by new criticism. In case of formalism, there is no importance about the culture of a text. There is no importance about the author of the text. There is no importance about the setting of the text. A text should be compared with the text itself. So that approach is called formalistic approach. That approach is called new critic approach. That was a dominant approach in America towards the middle part of 20th century. So Henry Remake's comment is quite similar. Hello, Bokul. It should be. Henry Remake's comment for American School of Comparative Literature invites universalism, and that can also, we can call that idea was initiated for the idea of new criticism or formalist approach of literature. And another critic, that is Galley, Australia and New Zealand. The Galley's contemporary Hutchinson Macaulay Prosnate, founding father of Antipodean comparative literature, and also proposed a non-nationalistic model. So after Henry Remake, these scholars, they are from Australia and New Zealand, Prosnate and Galley. They also supported that American approach, that is, yes, literature should be compared not within the boundary, that beyond the boundary we have to compare. So their approach is quite similar to the American approach of comparative literature. And the New World comparative literature was not originally ahistorical. If we take it granted, the new approach, that means the American approach of comparative literature, they didn't want to put focus on the history. So can we call that history kono gurutto ei approach nei? Here he said that New World comparative literature was not originally ahistorical. The difference between old and the new lay rather a distinction between ideas of what history was, and the evolutionary model accorded well with the forward-looking dynamics of society, freed from nationalistic conflict, but it was by no means always ahistorical. Arthur Marsh, professor of comparative literature at Harvard in 1980, defined the subject of the following terms: to examine the phenomena of literature as a whole, to compare them, to group them, to classify them, to inquire into the causes of them, to determine the results of them, and that is the true task of comparative literature. So history is not less important in comparative literature. That means we have to, according to Arthur Marsh, he says that we have to classify literature in different angles or in different subdivisions. That means we will be looking literature in several perspectives through the several schools of comparative literature. What are they? To group them, we can make a division of the literature. To classify them, we can have literature from the different perspectives. To inquire into the causes and the result of the literature. So, a literature can be seen in diversified perspectives if we want to study literature in comparison. Okay, so that was the scenario. Russian formalism and structuralism draws attention to the difference between Russian and American version. Okay, Russian formalism, they talked about the form, that means the form of a text, and American formalism, they have also talked about the text. The author is not important, but there is a difference. The two movements reflect a more general historical shift in the literary and the philosophical climate. With the passing of the 19th century, this shift often described as the reaction against positivism. What is positivism? Positivism, that means our literature is great and the other is not good. Okay. So Russian formalism, they talked about the form, and structuralism, they have talked about the structure. But what is positivism? Positivism, that means if anybody thinks about their own national literature only. So that idea is called very positive. That means our literature is good and the other literature is not good. Our literature can be great and other literature cannot be called great. So that attitude is a very dominating attitude, and that attitude in literature is called positivism. So Russian is formalism, and especially in case of comparative literature, Russian attitude can be called positivist attitude, but the American attitude can be called more universal attitude, not the positive attitude. Okay. So these are the pros and cons of comparative literature through the passage of the times we have got, and apart from this, we are also moving on only Europe and also America, New Zealand, and some other parts. And what happened to the post-colonial approach? We have also seen a comment done by Shapon Mojumdar, is it? Here, Shapon Mojumdar argues that Indian literature, like its African and Latin American counterparts, forms a community of what he calls subnational literature, no less robust than the component of Western literature. Shapon Mojumdar, another Indian critic, he said that the African literature, Arabian literature, European literature, American literature, England or Indian literature is not less important. Indian literature also has their identity. So Shapon Mojumdar wanted to say that yes, we have our literature, and that literature carries significance as well. So you can't discard Indian literature, because we know that the epic form was the earliest form in Indian literature. Ramayana, Mahabharata, yeah, they are the okay. So that is the position of Shapon Mojumdar. Shapon Mojumdar said yes, we have our literature, whatever may be the position, we love our literature, and that literature is great as well. Okay. So that was the nationalistic attitude of Indian literature, and they were trying to pinpoint their identity. So that was happening. The situation of African literature, Asian literature, Latin American literature as well, and the literature of China, for example, involves in the different notion of periodization. Indeed, a different concept of continuity and the history. And the portions of Indian authors, Mojumdar argues, that have remained renegotiable across generation because of the continuity characteristic of Indian tradition. So any tradition we can't discard. Every tradition, African tradition, Asian, Indian, American, Latin American, New Zealand, all forms, they have their importance, and they have their important field in literature. So in literature, anything cannot be aloof of comparison. According to American School of Comparative Literature, anything can be compared with anything else. And in this regard, we can say that American School of Comparative Literature offers universalism in terms of comparison. In other case, French School of Comparative Literature, they have called about influence and thought, but that can be that was including within the boundary of Europe and the other countries of Europe, nothing more. Okay, so that is the history or historical background of comparative literature in a brief. Okay, so any question?